Коллеги, добрый день.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to see you all here. We're about to begin the press conference by the Governor of the Bank of Russia, Elvira Nabiullina, and the Deputy Governor, Alexei Zabotkin. And we will begin with a statement by Bank of Russia, Governor Elvira Nabiullina, in follow-up to Board of Directors meeting today. Good afternoon. Today, we have made the decision to keep the key rate at 21% per annum. Price pressures have been easing gradually. We assume that this trend will continue and annual inflation will return to the target of 4% in 2026. Nevertheless, risks still exist. We need to maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period to bring inflation down. Our further moves will depend on how quickly and sustainably inflation will be decelerating. I would now dwell on the reasons behind our today's decision. Firstly, inflation. Its annual rate in March was slightly above 10%, while current price growth slowed down to about 7% in annualized terms. This level is still high and feels uncomfortable for both households and businesses. Nonetheless, owing to our monetary policy, disinflation will continue. Today, price growth is decelerating unevenly across consumer product groups. In March, the growth rates for non-food prices declined below 2% in annualized terms, whereas those of food and service prices decreased less notably and are so far close to 10%. This dispersion may be explained by different time lags of the key rate impact on various consumer market segments. Compared to service and food prices, non-food prices react more quickly to key rate changes, which is because durables are more frequently purchased on credit. High interest rates have caused a reduction in the loan portfolio and the demand for credit. As a result, the rise in non-food prices has slowed down significantly. As regards services and food, their prices are less responsive to changes in consumer lending, since the demand for them depends primarily on income dynamics. Furthermore, driven by higher incomes in recent years, the demand for services has been increasing faster than that for products, which also explains higher price growth rates in this group. As long as the price growth deceleration is not equally significant across all groups of goods and services, it would now be premature to draw any conclusions as to how sustainable the slowdown in headline inflation is. As demand cools down, the variance in price dynamics across groups will be decreasing. A high key rate is moderating inflation via several channels simultaneously. I have already spoken of the reduction in demand through higher loan rates. The deposit channel remains effective as well, encouraging savings. The third, foreign exchange channel, is also contributing to the deceleration of inflation. Tight monetary policy contains the demand for imports and makes ruble assets more attractive. This contributed to the ruble strengthening in the first quarter of the year, which has been easing price pressures as well. All these are sustainable factors supporting disinflation. In addition, the exchange rate has been propped up by better sentiment in financial markets that has been improving since the beginning of the year. However, in contrast to tight monetary policy, this factor might turn out to be more short-term. Despite the slowdown in current price growth, inflation expectations have barely changed since our meeting in March. While a further decrease in inflation expectations is critical to ensure sustainable disinflation. Our inflation forecast remains unchanged. Prices will rise by 7 to 8% in 2025 and by 4% next year. Further on, inflation will stabilize at the target. Secondly, the economy. GDP continues to grow, although at a more modest pace. This is proven by both statistics and a number of high-frequency indicators. In particular, companies participating in our monitoring now give more moderate estimates of the current output of goods and services. After a certain acceleration in January, the growth of consumption has slowed down. Due to the time lags I have already mentioned, a slower rise in demand is more noticeable in the segments of durables, but has not yet become that obvious in catering and tourism, for example. Investment activity is close to the high levels recorded last year. The vast majority of businesses participating in our monitoring plan to maintain or increase the amount of their investment this year. This topic is covered in our regional economy report. Nonetheless, the growth rates of investment will be apparently declining, which is confirmed by certain leading indicators such as the sales of trucks and agricultural machinery, as well as the utilization rates of transport infrastructure. Staff shortages are still a factor constraining the expansion of investment. Nevertheless, our monitoring shows some signs of an easing in the labor market. First sign, a number of companies have been increasing their demand for labor, which is accompanied by a transfer of workforce to other companies or sectors, yet unemployment stays at record lows. Second sign, enterprises plan a more moderate indexation of wages than over the previous 2 years. Thirdly, monetary conditions have remained nearly unchanged, ensuring the tightness needed to rein in inflation. Yield curves in the monetary market and the government bond market have shifted upward since our previous meetings. This is largely because market participants have revised their expectations about the key rate path upwards. High-frequency data for March suggests a slight decrease in deposit and loan rates. It is worth emphasizing that we not only track nominal interest rates, but also analyze them, taking into account inflation expectations. In the first quarter of the year, nominal rates and inflation expectations both declined. As a result, there was no notable change in price conditions. In March, credit activity remained subdued. Mortgage and corporate lending expanded slightly, whereas unsecured consumer lending contracted. In March, we said that lending dynamics were significantly affected by budget spending. Today, we can see that the impact of this factor has weakened, but lending growth continues to be moderate. I would like to stress that modest dynamics in lending are associated with lower demand for credit rather than limited credit supplied by banks. Banks have sufficient capital cushions. However, banks have decreased their risk appetite and therefore prefer a more conservative approach to selecting borrowers. Household saving activity has remained high despite a certain decline in deposit rates. Budget spending in March was closer to its seasonal norm. The expansion of money supply has slowed down, with its current growth rates being consistent with the goal of returning inflation to 4%. Now, I would like to speak of external conditions and changes in our forecast. Since our previous meeting, the revision of import tariffs by major economies has been the main issue. Our updated forecast assumes a slower expansion of the world economy. Lower global demand will drag down commodity prices. This is why we have adjusted the forecast crude oil price accordingly. We assume that it will be $5 per barrel lower this year. The forecast of exports has also been decreased somewhat. The dynamics of imports will be more modest as well amid tight monetary policy. As to the forecast for the Russian economy, the developments are generally close to our February scenario. Our April forecast contains only minor revisions in relation to foreign trade. As regards risks to the baseline scenario, one of the main risks is a more considerable cooling in the world economy due to trade wars. It is not just about how significantly import tariffs will ultimately increase, but also about the persistent uncertainty in markets caused by these decisions. All this is complicating investment planning. If additional risks associated with tariffs materialize, crude oil prices are likely to drop further. Moreover, there are still risks related to the labor market and inflation expectations. Inflation has been exceeding the target for the fourth consecutive year, and the mere fact of this causes increased inertia that prevents price growth rates from declining faster. Disinflationary risks have barely changed since our previous meeting. An essential factor, notably influencing our decisions, is fiscal policy. Our baseline forecast still assumes the return to the fiscal rule this year, which means that the budget policy will have a disinflationary effect. Taking into account the current developments in global markets, the Ministry of Finance notes that the fiscal rule might need adjustment. If the cut-off oil price is reduced, this might be an additional disinflationary factor. More importantly, such a revision will make the fiscal policy stance more robust in the long term in a scenario implying less favorable conditions in the global energy commodity market. I would like to stress that we always take into account any notable modification in fiscal policy and adjust our monetary policy accordingly. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future decisions. We will maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period. This is reflected in our forecast of the average key rate for this year that will be in the range of 19.5 to 21.5%. A high key rate will ensure a slowdown in current price growth to 4% by the end of this year and will help stabilize inflation at 4% in the future. Thank you for your attention. I am ready now to answer your question. Thank you. Dear colleagues, now we are starting the Q&A. Please introduce yourself and identify your agency. Margarita, please. Good afternoon, Rita Shpilevskaya, TASS Agency. I am insistent in raising a question whether you have discussed today lowering the key rate, and have there been any arguments in favor of these options? What were other decisions or options that you also had on the table? We had a broad consensus about keeping the rate as it was. We were rather debating the nuances of the signal or the message that we would be sending. In the second row, please. Ivan Shligin, FOMAG RU. My question about the stability and sustainability. How can you define that the disinflation is sustainable and stable? What are the indicators that would prop up to say that it can be described as a stable one? Some time ago, I think it was 12 months, when we defined certain triggers which would enable one to raise the question of reducing the key rate. And our vision of such triggers generally hasn't changed. Of course, we are analyzing a broad set of factors and trends, but in the first place, we pay attention to truly stable decline in the current inflation, stable decline in the inflationary expectations. We also note the slowdown of the consumer activity, consumer lending, lower tension in the labor market, as well as the lack of pro-inflationary shocks on the side of the budget or external conditions. So in terms of the above-mentioned factors, we already note a certain confirmation of such a trend, but we need a stronger certainty that this all put together is stable. Although compared to the last board meeting, many processes currently look more stable. Thank you. Tatiana, please. Tatiana Chibasova, Interfax Agency. What kind of scenario that the central bank was reviewing in its updated average scenario in terms of repatriation and the foreign exchange profit sales? Was it in line with the updated norms or extending it further? Well, honestly, never in the past nor now we considered to extend the existing order as one of the factors in our decision-making, because we believe to extend or non-extend it doesn't affect the ruble exchange rate dynamics, because we acknowledge the actual thing irrespective of how the requirements for the compulsory sale of currency earnings were, because our exporters were selling up to 75% and 80%. Currently we see that about 90% of the currency earnings are being sold, despite the fact that the standards are lower. So we simply didn't have it on the table. Next question, colleagues, comes online from Ina Bystritskaya from Kamensk-Uralsk. Against the backdrop of the economic decline, the European Central Bank reduced 7 times its rate since last June. It reduced the key rates by 25 basis points, and in this way, the basic rate was to 2.4 per annum on deposits to 25. The marginal rate was to 25 at the same time. The Russian Central Bank key rate is 21%. Why? In order to incentivize economic growth, financial regulators in US and Europe reduced the key rate in order to to fulfill the internal markets with cheap money while the Russian central bank raises it? Well, it's because the economic conditions in the US and the Europe are basically similar, although they are different. But in Russia, they are dramatically different. They have low inflation at around 2.5–3%. In our case, it is a high one, 10%. And by the way, when their inflation was growing after COVID, the central banks in those countries were very aggressively raising the key rate in some of the European countries, even slumped into recession. Now, why? Because there is an understanding amongst the countries which are targeting inflation that without low inflation, it is impossible to secure stable economic growth. And many may recall the US case in the beginning of the 1980s when the country suffered from double-digit inflation. The Fed rate was raised up to 20%. There are less well-known examples. Even before the Eurozone was established, for example, in Spain, in the end of the 1980s, inflation ran up to 25% and the key rate was above 30%. But I suppose another factor which is worth mentioning in this regard is that over the decade-long low inflation policy in the US and Europe, people have grown used to such a low inflation and they are no longer fearing price hikes, understanding that even if there are one-off price hikes, then the central banks would definitely bring inflation to target. In the economic language, that is described an anchored inflation expectation. What does it mean? It means that even when there's a price hike, people and households are not running to department stores to hoard goods, being afraid that they would become more expensive and buy foreign exchange. And thanks to that, the central banks are not forced to raise the key rate very quickly in order to compensate the price hikes. In our case, we have a different situation because households are expecting sufficiently high inflation. The recent monitoring demonstrated that the people are expecting inflation to be at 13%, which requires from us pursuing a tighter monitoring policy, a higher level of interest rates. But after inflation is down in a sustainable way and will remain low through a long period of time, our low key rates will definitely be a sure thing. Okay, colleagues, next one. Maria, please. Maria Ilyusina, Bitcoin. I've got a question about stability as well. In what way the Russian central bank's confidence changed in terms of the changes in the ruble exchange rate compared to the March meeting? Compared to the March meeting, yes, indeed, our take on it slightly changed. The bigger part of the appreciation which has taken place since the beginning of the year we explained by more stable factors in the first place, dictated by the tight monetary policy conditions. And in as far as this part is concerned, ruble appreciation is part of a disinflationary process, a more subtle demand dynamics, stronger attractiveness of the ruble as the savings instrument, but we're not yet in a position to explain the whole of the ruble appreciation by the effects of the monetary policy, because the news backdrop related to the geopolitics makes a contribution, and I believe that in as far as this is concerned, it's premature to talk about the stable process in ruble appreciation, because you not only have to take into the account the market expectations, but actual shifts. Yes, please. If I may, I would like to underscore that part of the ruble appreciation is a stable thing, but there is a difference in thinking in terms of which part of it can be considered as a solid one and should be taken into account in the future disinflationary dynamics, and which part of it should be considered as a temporary phenomenon in a common sense way. Yes, dear colleagues, please. Elvira, in the last row, please. Good afternoon. Elvira Musina, RIA Novosti, Elvira Sahibzadovna. Earlier, you said that the peak of annual inflation in Russia was to be reached in April. Could you please tell me, have we passed this peak, do you think? And if not, what is your updated forecast? Well, there are different inflation indicators at play. We primarily take a look at the current price growth, which characterizes the current inflationary pressure. And in this regard, I believe that we passed the peak in fourth quarter. So such kind of the current price growth rates, considering seasonality, they have gone down almost twice in Q1 compared to the last year's Q4. But the annual inflation, we believe, and its decline will start in May, because it all depends which last year's month we are comparing it to. A certain inflation rise is possible in July, which could be attributed to a constant thing, which is the utility services price indexations. Marina, next one, please. Marina Pimenova, NTV Business News. The first VTB deputy chairman continues his metaphoric series describing central bank as a doctor on Neglinia and the 21% key rate as an experimental pill. Can you please pronounce the diagnosis in your capacity as a doctor? It's a very figurative comparison, because we ourselves like to use metaphors, but this comparison, I believe, is the one that you should take with a bit of a pinch of salt, because a high key rate, tight monetary policy, these are not experiments, but the kind of decisions which have been proven by time and again in many countries. And these are very effective medications. I would say this is a very kind of a targeted treatment that the central banks have been successfully applying. But insufficient dosing can only exacerbate patients' condition. We always compare high inflation with a high temperature that the human body is experiencing. So this high key rate is helping us to treat this overheating, and we can also state now that inflation has started going down. But the prescribed regimen must be fulfilled to the very end in order to avoid disasters. Thanks very much. The next question comes online from Seda Magomedova from Chechnya Today, from Grozny. Good afternoon, Elvira Nabiullina. I've got the following question. In Chechen Republic, the bigger part of the food basket is made up of the food products. What kind of instruments the Bank of Russia can apply in order to reduce the food price volatility? Thank you for the question. It is indeed a very important one. Overall, the share of food products and the share of food in consumer basket is quite sizable. And in Chechen Republic, it is higher than average throughout the country. I think it is 44% against 33%, with the exception of alcoholic beverages. Now, food prices has this nature of a high volatility. In the first place, about vegetables and fruits. These fluctuations are contributed to by farming, because we know that after a good yield, the prices for vegetables and greeneries, they grow slower. If the year wasn't really the best one, then with new yield, prices grow faster. We, as the central bank, are not in a position to influence prices of separate product items. We use our instruments to impact the overall price dynamics. But when inflation is low and predictable, then prices per individual products are not changing fast and changing narrowly. If we take a look at the past history, during the years when we had a stable, moderate inflation, 2017, 18, 19, the dispersion of prices in between individual products was quite small. Over the past several years, in a high inflation environment, it doubled. So the overall reduction of inflation will definitely make the food prices remain stable without changing broadly. Within individual product groups, the government has the necessary toolkit in order to make things more acceptable. They do that. It could be aimed at incentivizing various supplies and various subsidies to processing industries, to farming, regulation of quotas, and another number of other measures. Thanks very much, colleagues. Konstantin, please. Good afternoon. Konstantin Churikov, Russia 24. The Bank of Russia forecasts the growth of economy this year at the level of 1 to 2%, the Ministry of Economic Development at the level of 2.5%. Why is such a lower forecast by the central bank, and are there not any plans in the making to revise it? We have just revised our forecast, and we kept our assessment of the GDP growth unchanged. However, why we have such differences? I guess that the central bank is always a conservative institution because we act on an assumption that even against the conservative development of things, we need to achieve our target and bring inflation down to 4%. Our basic differences with the Ministry of Economic Development forecasts are because they're more optimistic towards exports in terms of the foreign trade conditions. So exports, and I would say more optimistic in our assessment of the Russian economic growth potential, because we think that the economic potential has grown, continues to grow as the result of large-scale investments done over the previous years, but the extent to which it has grown and how it will transform to the labor productivity growth is a bit early to make such a conclusion. It grows more than would have a disinflationist scenario, which is very close to the one that the Ministry of Economic Development has put together. So this is one of the probable scenarios that we are considering. So if the events unfold according to this scenario, quite possibly, then indeed the inflation may slow down faster and the monetary policy will become softer. Thank you. Colleagues, Sergei, in the second row, please. Sergei Bolotov, the Russian Gazette. On the eve, the Bank of Russia made a decision about the macroprudential policy, and these decisions affect mortgage, car loans, consumer loans, and corporate lending. Could you please explain what kind of impact upon the market this decision may generate and what kind of consequences consumers may feel? We indeed have put some adjustment into the macroprudential set, and we've taken a look at all the components, including mortgage market and unsecured loans. We've fine-tuned things somewhere, but overall our policy is aimed at protecting the rights of the people to prevent the growing risk indebtedness. And we, for the first time, have established limitations over the mortgage lending exactly in the territories of the high-risk credits that the borrowers fall into the overdue status with more often. Macro markups are the ones that we have brought down within some segments. Therefore, we expect that our measures would somewhat raise the level of attraction of mortgage for the banks, as well as make the mortgage more affordable to the households. And the most riskier loans is where we have a bit of a leeway, where the banks won't have to toughen up their conditions compared to the current levels. But these limitations were necessary in order not to worsen the situation down, and so as of July 1st, the banks won't be in a position to grow up their lending portfolio. In terms of the car loans, we acted on the assumption of how many loans the banks are currently issuing to the individuals, in terms of the ones who are spending on servicing such loans more than half of their income. For those who want to buy a car, nothing will change, but there are situations when people go for a consumer loan, specifically not a purpose-specific auto loan, but the consumer loan, securitizing it with their existing vehicle. And so in this particular segment, the banks started issuing loans to people with a debt loan higher than average. I think it was 80% in the second quarter of 2024 and 44% in Q1 25. So our measures will be conducive to a gradual improvement of the situation in this segment, because we believe that the banks must not overload households with the credits using the property that individuals may eventually lose. Colleagues, Rita, please. Margarita Mordovina, RBK. Could you please tell us, has the Bank of Russia already acknowledged the consequences or the effects from the new trade wars? Have these already impacted the Russian economy, and what kind of impact they may still generate in the future? What kind of consequences do you expect to see? According to what we think, the situation is evolving quite dynamically, and we need to monitor it further in terms of what kind of import tariffs will emerge eventually. We took the trade wars into account in our forecast, like I already said. We have reduced the rates of growth expectations for the world economy. We have reduced our oil price expectations because the main channel of impact upon the Russian economy from these trade wars is the prices falling for our main export staples. The main factors, they are limited in terms of our foreign trade structure, and because there are certain limitations in the area of capital flows. Mr. Zabotkin? Yes, and it is quite evident that the impact from the trade wars will strongly depend upon the scale of the protectionist measures and the fragmentation of the world trade flows which will emerge out of it, which is a strong uncertainty compared to our baseline scenarios. The current picture, as you can see, hasn't led to any considerable change in our baseline forecast. Thanks. The next question comes online from Andrei Pushkaryov, the Russian Gazette from Primorsk area. As is well known, there is a trade war flaring in the world initiated by the US. The Chinese authorities announced that they are developing a set of measures to incentivize consumer market, which will be able to offset some of the losses that they suffer because of the American initiatives. In Europe, the government suggested that all of the households will be paid compensation in order to stimulate household activity and simply to help people against the growing prices. Why in Russia such measures are excluded because of a fear of an overheating economy? Well, it's an extension in a certain way of the previous question. Trade wars, they affect different countries. It depends upon the structure of foreign trade, whether import duties, the U.S. import duties directly effective, whether the targeted country undertakes response measures, essentially depending upon the foreign trade structure. If, let's say, any country used to export a lot of its goods to the United States because of the tariffs, that would become less profitable. And these goods they will try to redirect them to the external markets. Not always it is possible. Not only that, but also to the domestic markets. And so this is the situation that China is facing and some other countries. And that is why the government authorities are trying to support their consumers in order for them to be able to afford to buy these products. But at the same time, in terms of unfavorable consequences, price-wise, such support won't have, although there could be a certain pro-inflationary effects coming. In Russia's case, it's different because the amount of Russian exports, US bound, is insignificant, and there's no need to incentivize domestic demand to offset the declining foreign demand. So to us, the direct impact is minimal. To us, the tariff impact is indirect, like I used to say, via a much weaker global demand, lower demand, global demand for commodities. And this is not a disinflationary risk like in Japan or China, but very much a pro-inflationary one. Mr. Zabotkin? It's worth reminding you that in China, inflation either a 0.1 or a -1, and has been that several quarters in a row. and they are fighting against the risk of deflation. And the demand is very subdued in our situation in terms of there being a concern with some sort of overheating, that the growth has ran much ahead of the productivity growth. It is vividly confirmed that inflation is 10%, and we need to bring it down to lower levels. To speak about the demand shortages is not well grounded. Thank you. Dear colleagues, please, Natasha. Natalia Trushina, Moscow Komsomolets. The holiday season, the vacation season is coming, and because of that, many Russians are buying foreign currency, are planning to do so in the next few days. But at the same time, the dollar exchange rate since the beginning of the year went down by more than 20%. So, respectively, quite clearly, the Bank of Russia is not issuing any forecast. Maybe you could give us an advice as to what people should do, because in the past we could really make our own guesses, but it doesn't work anymore. So, should one follow a political statement? Should one monitor the domestic policy or inflation or anything else that the Bank of Russia may do, or the monetary authorities? Should one go and buy hard currency right now, or sit and wait for a more favorable exchange rate? Well, the exchange rate is affected by a congregation of factors. One of the most important one is a monetary policy, because you spoke more about other kind of factors, geopolitics and global trade wars. Something that is currently affecting the exchange rate, I mean the set of factors, they work in a diverse way, because our tight monetary policy and the positive market sentiment and the positive expectations toward geopolitics, they strengthen the ruble. The global trade wars, oil prices, these weaken the ruble. Now, to really unpack and see what is the ratio that each of these factors generates is difficult. So we assess the appreciation of ruble as a stable, because we see certain stable things in it, but at the same time we see temporary things playing out within that dimension. So the experts who are saying it, let me remind you that we have a floating exchange rate. We're not issuing any forecast about the exchange rate, but what the people should keep in mind, I think they should rely upon common sense, as always, and one should grant the Russians this capacity, because we see that people are acting in the exchange market very rationally with a benefit to themselves, and the economists are describing it as a counter-cyclical behavior. Thanks, Elena. Elena Fabrichnia, Reuters. I also wanted to ask you a question about the trade wars. The central bank primarily analyzes the risks of the trade wars, but yesterday the president called to find the opportunities in these trade wars for the Russian economy. What did he mean? So based upon your assessment of the ruble appreciation, do you acknowledge any inflow of capital from the friendly countries into the Russian market because of the interest rates differences? As far as any difficult situation is concerned, yes, indeed, we pay a lot of attention to risk, but in any situations there are also opportunities, and our businesses are very savvy in using these opportunities. What do trade wars mean? Indeed, they mean a certain change of possible weights in between the representation of different businesses in different markets, and when such changes take place, our businesses also have to become more active, because relative competitiveness changes and the productivity gains may change. So that's what is meant by it. But as far as the latter part of the question, the inflow of capital from friendly countries. Yes, last time there were expectations and questions were raised, more optimistic expectations towards geopolitics may result in a stronger inflow of capital into our markets. We do not see any significant capital flows coming in. Mr. Zabotkin? Whenever capital flows are being discussed, somehow the focus is more upon foreign investors, but in capital flows, Russian citizens also play a very significant role, and Russian investors, under the conditions when the level of the interest rates in the economy is very high and the ruble rates are high and attractive for Russian investors, consequently, they may adjust the structure of their portfolios, including the currency structure of their savings, in favor of shifting them more into ruble-denominated instruments. And that is also a capital flow, but from the point of view of the Russian investors. Thank you. Colleagues, please, Mikhail in the last row. Mikhail Marseille, Frank Media. Recently, we've noticed frequent instances of the public pressure from politicians upon the heads of the central banks. A recent case, a very tough rhetoric by the US President Donald Trump towards Fed. In Russia, there are some politicians that demand that the central bank should change its monetary policy. What kind of risks do you see coming from such a pressure upon the global macroeconomic stability? Do you agree that this pressure has become stronger? And to what extent you believe the threat to the central banks to lose their independence real? Yeah, that's it. As far as we're concerned, when the rates are high, the level of criticism also grows, and there is nothing surprising in it. We will continue acting on our mission to reduce inflation. But as far as the general global trend is concerned, yes, we do ascertain that the criticism of the central banks in many countries has grown. But nevertheless, we believe that even right now, the world central banks are capable of retaining their independence. Why? Why independence was introduced for the central banks? Because society is interested in having macroeconomic stability. The society is interested in maintaining macroeconomic stability. In the majority of cases, there is an awareness that in order to achieve it, it's very important for a central bank to be independent in as far as monetary policy action is concerned. And what kind of independence we're talking about? In the case of Russian central bank, it is about us pursuing monetary policy independently from other government agencies and other executive bodies. But our policy is 100% transparent, and the central bank is subordinate to the Russian parliament. Essentially, the independence of the central bank is an indication of a mature economic policy. And that is why many countries followed that path, so as to avoid temptation to solve many important tasks by accelerating inflation, by sacrificing the well-being of the people in favor of dealing with short-term goals. Let me remind you that high inflation is something that makes people suffer, the ones who have low incomes. And in reality, stepping away from the principle of independence of central banks, and we could see how such a thing happened in some countries, that really undermines domestic trust towards domestic currency, that may create risks to financial stability and leads to inflation. And so, the recent eloquent example shows that the consequences then require a lot of time to be solved. Thank you. Next question online from Denis Yalachowski. Denis, please. Good afternoon. In your annual statement, which has the main guidelines of the monetary policy, one finds also the scenario of the global crisis. And some analysts currently believe that we're already in it because the deglobalization, strengthening, recession growing in major economies, a loss in the value of financial assets. But there are other analysts as well who believe that the situation doesn't look like a risk scenario, maybe only in as far as the oil prices are concerned. Which side are you on amongst these analysts? To what extent, according to your recent estimates, the probability is high that the risk scenario that was written in your guidelines in 2025 will become a baseline? And if positive, then what kind of the central key rate the central bank may adopt towards the end of the year? Well, indeed, the worsening of trade relations between US and China has been included into our risk scenario assessment, but still we believe that the current environment is very far from the kind of the risks set which we described as one of the alternatives in our main guidelines of the monetary policy. The risk scenario anticipates a much more notable and strong adjustment of the global growth, much lower global economic development rate, oil prices, and more pessimistic expectation towards the Russian GDP and inflation. Our updated baseline forecast is truly is different in terms of understanding the external conditions, like I said, but in terms of there being any major changes in our vision of the domestic development compared to the February forecast is something that we did not have. Of course, we will closely monitor the external environment because in this worsening, we describe it as one of the key pro-inflationary risks. Thank you, colleagues. Nikita, in the second row. Good afternoon. Nikita Mitrofanov, Economic Telegram channel. I would like to raise all questions about the tariff wars so as not to postpone them until the next time. But right now I want to ask you not about what is currently taking place, but about the assessment of potential results. Because the U.S. declares the potential outcome of these trade wars is the dollar weakening against the basic global currencies. Now, does the central bank assess the risk of depreciating U.S. dollar? Because on the one side it's positive, the ruble will become stronger. This is disinflation. But on the other hand, a lot of savings are denominated in dollars, and so some of the reserves that the central bank has is also in dollars, so you will have to reconsider that. Well, as far as what we think about the future, it is difficult to draw expectations because situation changes very quickly. Possible worsening of external conditions when the level of tariff protection, because I believe that the level of tariff protection is much stronger on the U.S. side than it used to be before the current events, maybe slightly lower than currently is being discussed, and that may significantly affect the global economics. But as far as the Russian economy is concerned, I shall repeat it again. We believe that this impact is very limited, and the main channel is via the reduction of the global economic growth, possible lower demand for the commodities, possible lower demand for the Russian export staples, and the impact upon the exchange rate. We believe that this effect could be a pro-inflationary one. But in as far as other impactful channels are concerned, important for other countries, we've got fewer of those. Why? Because our exports is primarily a commodity-based one. And so the commodity exports, if you don't talk about, is depends upon the global economic growth. It's less elastic towards the exchange rate changes. If you want me to answer your question specifically about the exchange rate impact, the volumes of non-commodity exports in our case are not growing. They're not very significant. But in as far as the possible impact upon our domestic conditions is concerned, the Russian citizens and Russian businesses are saving more in rubles. We have gone through a very strong decline in the hard currency savings, so the currency positions that the banks have, the currency exposure, is very balanced thanks to the regulation that we have been pursuing. Mrs. Zapotkin, would you like to add something or not? Okay. Dear colleagues, next one. Maria, please. Maria, Izvestia newspaper. I've got another question about the trade wars. You already mentioned earlier that for Russia, trade wars represent pro-inflationary risk. What do you think? How many percentage points inflation may add up, specifically because of the trade wars and lower oil prices? And to what extent this could be a long-playing thing? We do not distinguish individual factors separately. So for me to say or to identify what kind of specific effect in percentage points or in inflation there will come, I will hardly give it to you, but generally speaking, protectionism leads to the slower global economic growth. I shall reiterate again because it deters consumption, it disrupts supply chain, productivity slows down. So the scale of this effect not only depends upon the extent to which this protectionism is becoming stronger, because it is becoming stronger now, but what kind of forms and shapes it acquires and what kind of reactions there may take place and what kind of industries are suffering most. Our forecast for Russia, in as far as the GDP and inflation are concerned, as you can see, remain unchanged, although we have slightly lowered our estimates of the global GDP rate growth as well as oil price growth. But the uncertainty is very strong indeed, and against a more dramatic scale, I mean, fragmentation of the global economy, a much deeper slowdown of the global growth, pro-inflationary effects may become and could become much more significant, and our monetary policy will influence it. Varvara Mikhalchova, market power. The target inflation value, 4%, was against a different economic structure. But now we see that a lot has changed, both in the country and globally. So my question is, under which conditions the target inflation value may be changed? Thank you. We are confident in the fact that the low inflation is a necessary condition for a sustainable development. Both important for households and businesses in any economic structure. It is very difficult to imagine that under certain other conditions or structural changes, people would enjoy to live in a high inflation environment. I would tell you that our target level, 4%, if you take a look at other countries, is an upper threshold of what may be considered as price stability. Longer term, yes, of course, this target level can be changed, but only one way, downward. Let me remind you that in the majority of countries where the same kind of monetary policy is being pursued, and that is comprised of the majority of countries which produce a prevalent amount of global GDP, their inflation target is much lower than in our case, 2 to 3%. Even in the countries with emerging economics, in many of them it is lower than in our case. And indeed, during the period of intense structural changes like what was the case in 2022, certain in a certain way, the inflation may be high, in order to just slightly high, in order to allow the businesses to adjust, but it doesn't mean that we give up on our inflation target. And we can see that as of the second half of 2023, inflation demonstrates a totally different nature because of an overheated demand rather than in the intensity of the structural changes. And so to put up with a high inflation, there is no reason to. And by the way, we've always noted that if this country's inflation is much higher than in other countries, then the ruble will fall into a continuous depreciation. High inflation also means high rates. If you raise the inflation target, we will never see low rates and low interest rates. Against any structure, like I said previously, high inflation is detrimental both to households and businesses. Thank you. The next question online from Konstantin Zhuravlov, the tourist of the north from the Archangel. During the past week, a number of big banks announced that they will give up on the fees when issuing family mortgage, but they warned that that would lead to lower volumes of mortgage. Does central bank monitor different kinds of mortgage lending, family mortgage, not mortgage, and does the central bank share this view that if the fee is retracted, that would bring the volumes down? Of course, we monitor different types of subsidized mortgage, market-based mortgage as well, but nevertheless we insist upon the banking fee to be suspended, because in the end of the day, these fees result in more expensive housing, which essentially contradicts the logic, the rationale of the subsidized programs, which are called upon to ensure affordability of housing. You see? In as far As, like you said, the banks have concerns that the fees will bring down the amount of lending that the banks won't see any profit in it. If it happens, it's going to be short-lived. Why? Because in subsidized programs, there is a broad range of banks participating, and not all of them started charging commission. Those who didn't, actually, that proves that even without a fee, subsidized mortgage remains an interesting product for the banks. Besides that, the Minister of Finance raised the compensation for the banks. So it's, let's say, 24.5% upon the category of housing against the previous 23%. But at the same time, you need to keep in mind that the deposit rates also went down to 20%, which is 1.5 percentage points, and the banks may continue to earn money from the subsidized mortgage. But what will happen? Competition will bring around a situation where the share of the banks that are reducing the lending is going to really contract, and those who will continue working without a fee will increase their volumes. Another reason is that the banks are interested to lend a mortgage, because in the end of the day, that depends upon the return of the loans that they had previously issued to the developers. And that is why we keep our forecast in terms of the annual mortgage portfolio growth. It's in the interval in between 3 to 8% annually. Thank you, colleagues. Please, Natalia Kotovskaya, Pro-Finance. The rate of growth of corporate lending in March has speeded up, reaching 0.9% compared to a more moderate rate in March at the low of 0.1, almost close to zero. Could you please tell us, this data, has it affected your decision-making today in any way? Also, can one believe that the corporate lending slowdown trend that the central bank saw over the past several months have been turned around? No, it hasn't turned around. This is a sudden acceleration, I shall say. A certain acceleration. This is not the kind of the monthly rate that we remember from last year as an average. So this is an acceleration of the corporate lending that did occur in March, was to be expected. The January and February growth was lowered because of the fiscal flows, and we openly said it. And the businesses, in having received an advance payments from the budget, were actively paying back on their then existing debts. But it is important to talk here not about any specific corporate lending, because it is important for us to understand not only about the lending, really. It is important to understand how the demand is behaving, and what's indicative are the current rates of growth of the money mass. We see that it has slowed down because we've got the necessary data, and these rates do coincide with our drive towards reducing inflation to 4% in 2026. The annual lending growth also continues to decelerate, which also reconciles well with our forecast, because if you could see it, if you remember, we haven't changed anything in our forecast and as far as this point is concerned. All right, thank you. Are there any more questions? Julia, please. Julia Tikhonova, Don't Click magazine. Could you tell us, can one expect a lower key rate this year? How high is the probability? What was the second part? How high is the probability of the key rate being lowered down this year? Well, I mean, if you take a look at our forecast for the key rate this year, you will see that there is a possibility of both the key rate going down as well as growing, although compared to the previous Board of Directors meeting, we believe that the probability of the key rate being brought up has weakened. We're saying that it will be necessary to maintain tight monetary conditions for a long period of time, because we feel that if inflationary expectations are going to go down, and at the same time, even if the key rate is lowered, we will need to maintain tight monitoring conditions, because the tightness of the monetary conditions to us is important in real terms, because even if the nominal key rate is brought down, if the inflation expectations go down, then we will need to maintain the tightness in our monetary terms. Thank you. Is there any questions? Yes, Luba, please, go ahead. Thank you. Lubov Nehedova, Expert magazine. The analysts are currently saying that the current appreciation of the ruble is excessive in terms of the risks that was related to the oil and gas incomes into the fiscal system. If you take a look at the impact that the exchange rate makes upon inflation, is there any threshold beyond which it may start accelerating? I didn't understand your question. If there's any limitation or any boundary beyond which inflation may accelerate, I mean, the appreciation of the ruble, may it become excessive at a certain point in time compared to the central bank targets? Well, appreciation of the ruble is disinflationary, so it doesn't bring about higher inflation. To us, it is important to understand, I should say, how stable it is. I mean, appreciation of the ruble is always disinflation, but you know that we never issue any forecasts or any quantitatives, landmarks in terms of the exchange rate. We have a floating exchange rate. It is important for us to achieve lower inflation against any odds, against any circumstances, external or domestic. So the current exchange rate, and shall I repeat my answer to the previous questions, in exchange rate appreciation, you find stable factors as well as temporary ones. So at this point in time, it's difficult to come up with any precise estimates. It is difficult, but we believe that compared to our last Board of Directors meeting, that we are more confident that the stable factors bear a more significant impact in the appreciation of the ruble. But I believe that what's your concern is a repetitive depreciation of the ruble. If any dramatic change take place of this sizable scale, externally and domestically, yes, of course, exchange rate may weaken, and we do note it as pro-inflationary risk, and if that happens, we'll adjust our monetary policy against what other things being equal, it will become much tighter. But I will underscore it again, that the current monetary policy is sufficiently tight, and it is an important and stable factor in appreciating the exchange rate during the past 3 months. Mr. Zapotkin? Well, maybe in as far as the appreciation of the ruble is stable, such appreciation correlates with the revision of the inflation expectations and the inflation forecast. If a significant currency appreciation occurs, that will definitely be accounted for when making decisions with regard to the monetary policy, in as far as that may improve the future inflation. Thank you very much. And we've got an online question from Anna Gromova. Anna, please. Good afternoon, Anna Gromova from Anna Finance Blog. My question is, in 2024, the number of borrowers in microfinance institutions grew by 24%. The quarter of such growth came from sales within one particular marketplace. Very often, the buyers in the marketplace do not understand that payment in installments means just a loan. And the subscribers are saying that whenever they buy installments from the marketplace, they recall, like in the past brands that have left the country, they offered installments, and are noting that it works in a different way right now, that even inside such a purchase via marketplace, the rates grow. With this in mind, I have a question. Does the central bank monitor this? Does it regulate it? And in terms of protecting borrowers from purchasing, from impromptu purchases, would it be worth to introduce certain limitations so as not to allow people to buy a certain product on an installment base beyond a certain price limit? Well, we believe that to prohibit such lending or such products, we shouldn't, because that would reduce the affordability and availability of such products to households. But I do agree that there are certain issues that should be addressed, and one should protect people from being, pushed into such purchases, irrespective whether it happens on an e-commerce marketplace or anywhere else, because paying an installment is exactly a bit of a lending scheme. So it is important to pass the law on installment purchases, which is currently being debated by the Russian parliament, which would improve the transparency of this market and would institute the rules that would protect those who use it, because in the banking sector, these issues have, in many ways, have already been regulated, and so we need to introduce respective regulations to the marketplaces. By the way, we also propose to the government to include into this draft act, which they are putting together about the platform economy, a number of norms which will protect a human being from poor quality information, non-transparency, and protect from falling in a situation where certain lending is going to be forced upon it, because, it's microfinance institutions are standing in line to receive any profit from people buying things from the marketplaces in Estonia. We've got a very well-concerted position with the government and with the legislature. Yes, consumers must be very well protected, irrespective of what kind of platform, what kind of banks, what kind of organizations are in this arrangement that make it possible for them to buy what they want to buy. All right, dear colleagues, if there are no more... Oh, yeah, I see Ekaterina. It's her first question, and this is going to be our last question, please. Hello, Ekaterina Ermilova. Banking review. Going back to the previous question. Because of the appreciation of the ruble, will the Bank of Russia undertake certain specific measures in as far as the monetary policy actions are concerned? And if so, could you please share them with us? Well, our policy is in us not targeting the exchange rate. We're targeting inflation. Therefore, the measures aimed at somehow, in a very purposeful way, to influence any exchange rate is what we're not doing. The exchange rate is defined by the export revenue dynamics, by the interest rates. A high key rate in terms of the monetary policy, yes, it does also affect the exchange rate. And so, from this point of view, we indeed generate a certain impact, and the appreciation of the ruble in many ways reflects the tight monetary policy. So the current ruble appreciation, if it is stable, it doesn't contradict anything. On the contrary, it is in line with us achieving our target of bringing inflation to 4%. And so if this ruble appreciation remains stable and firm, it would mean that a bigger space is being created for an earlier reduction of the key rate. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your very interesting questions.